Everyone thought the DNA test would ruin her life. She stayed silent while the world judged her. But when the results arrived, they didn't just confirm paternity. They exposed a man who mistook control for certainty and triggered his own downfall. A billionaire publicly accused his pregnant wife of lying about her unborn child, believing his power would silence her before the truth ever surfaced. It happened in a setting designed to celebrate success, certainty, and legacy, a place where doubt was never supposed to exist. The event was framed as a milestone for the company, a polished gathering of investors, executives, and media figures who had come to witness stability. No one expected it to become the moment where a private fracture turned into a public reckoning. The venue itself reflected dominance. Floor-to-ceiling glass, controlled lighting, carefully placed branding, and an audience conditioned to applaud confidence. This was not just a corporate event. It was a performance of authority. When the billionaire stepped onto the stage, the room responded exactly as it always had. Applause followed him, not because of what he said, but because of who he was. Years of influence had trained people to listen without questioning. His wife stood nearby, visibly pregnant, her presence framed as symbolic rather than personal. To the audience, she represented continuity, legacy, and reassurance. To him, she had become something else entirely. The shift did not happen suddenly, but this was the first time it was revealed without disguise. As he spoke, his tone remained measured, controlled, almost casual. There was no anger in his voice, which made what followed far more unsettling. He questioned paternity openly, not with accusation, but with implication. His words were precise, carefully chosen to sound reasonable rather than cruel. He spoke of clarity, of responsibility, of the importance of truth for someone in his position. Then he crossed the line that could not be erased. He suggested that his wife had deceived him, that the child she carried might not be his. The statement landed in the room like a sudden drop in pressure, leaving silence where applause had been expected. His wife did not respond. She did not look at him or at the audience. She did not defend herself, correct him, or ask for privacy. Her stillness was immediate and deliberate. In that moment, silence was not weakness. It was the only form of control left to her. Any reaction would have been used against her, framed as emotional instability or guilt. By remaining composed, she denied him that narrative. The audience shifted uncomfortably. People exchanged glances, unsure whether they had just witnessed a calculated move or an irreversible mistake. This was not a rumor or a leak. It was an accusation delivered in real time, on a public stage, with cameras recording every angle. The discomfort grew as it became clear that no clarification was coming. The billionaire continued speaking, moving on as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, reinforcing his dominance through indifference. Media response was immediate. Within minutes, speculation began spreading beyond the room. Headlines formed before facts could be verified. His status ensured that his words carried weight, and hers carried doubt. She was framed as suspicious, her silence misinterpreted as avoidance rather than restraint. Commentators questioned her credibility without evidence, relying solely on the authority of the man who had accused her. The imbalance was complete. Wealth, reputation, and narrative control aligned behind him. The accusation did not just challenge her integrity. It redefined her publicly. She was no longer seen as a partner or a mother-to-be, but as a potential threat to a powerful legacy. The humiliation was total, delivered without raised voices or visible cruelty, which made it more difficult to confront. Behind the scenes, advisors recognized the severity of what had happened. This was not a private dispute. It was a reputational event with legal implications. Accusations of paternity fraud are not neutral statements. They carry consequences that extend beyond marriage into governance, ethics, and accountability. But the billionaire appeared unconcerned. His confidence suggested that he believed the accusation itself had settled the matter. What fractured that evening was not just a marriage, but an illusion. For years, his authority had gone unchallenged because it was rarely tested. Control had been maintained through contracts, influence, and silence. This moment exposed how fragile that control actually was. By choosing a public setting, he had eliminated the possibility of quiet resolution. Everything that followed would now exist on record. His wife understood this instantly. As the room emptied and conversations fractured into whispers, she remained composed. She did not seek comfort or confrontation. She understood that the accusation was not meant to discover truth, but to assert power. And power, when misused publicly, leaves evidence behind. The marriage did not end that night in a formal sense, but something irreparable occurred in front of witnesses. Trust was not broken privately. It was dismantled publicly. The accusation changed the rules of engagement. There would be no return to discretion, no opportunity to rewrite the narrative without consequences. Later, as footage circulated and interpretations hardened, the billionaire remained certain of his position. He believed that authority was enough, that doubt could be imposed as easily as policy. What he did not consider was that accusations demand resolution. Once spoken aloud, they create obligations. Silence no longer protects the accuser. It protects the record. To reinforce his dominance and eliminate uncertainty, he made a final decision. He demanded evidence. A DNA test, he insisted, would confirm what he already believed and close the matter permanently. In his mind, proof would end resistance and restore order. He saw it as the final step in reasserting control, unaware that by demanding verification, he had shifted power away from himself. The accusation that was meant to silence her had instead set the stage for something far more dangerous. Proof does not belong to those who demand it. It belongs to the truth it reveals. And the truth, once documented, does not care who believed they were untouchable. When control replaces trust, love becomes conditional and truth becomes dangerous. The marriage had not begun with cruelty or suspicion, at least not in ways visible from the outside. It began with structure, with rules that were presented as safeguards rather than restraints. From the earliest days, the relationship was shaped less by intimacy and more by alignment, as if partnership required constant verification. What appeared orderly soon revealed itself as calculated. Power imbalance was not accidental. It was foundational. He brought wealth, influence, and a public identity that consumed every shared space. She brought intellect, independence, and a professional reputation that once stood on its own. Over time, those elements were rebalanced through quiet decisions framed as mutual. Invitations were declined on her behalf. Schedules were optimized. Priorities were redefined. Nothing was demanded outright. Everything was guided. The prenuptial agreement was introduced as a standard precaution, something reasonable people accepted when stakes were high. Its language was dense, neutral in tone, and reassuring in presentation. He spoke of protection, of clarity, of avoiding misunderstandings. She reviewed it with confidence, believing her competence insulated her from vulnerability. What she underestimated was how thoroughly the agreement favored preservation of his authority over shared accountability. Clauses limited access to assets, restricted disclosures, and outlined penalties for reputational harm that were broad enough to discourage dissent. Loyalty was defined expansively, while autonomy was framed as optional. Compliance was rewarded quietly. Resistance carried consequences that were never spelled out aloud. The document did not demand submission. It incentivized it. As the marriage progressed, emotional monitoring replaced conversation. Her reactions were evaluated rather than understood. Questions about her tone, her timing, her demeanor surfaced regularly, always under the guise of concern. He did not accuse her of wrongdoing. He suggested adjustment. He did not isolate her overtly. He redirected her attention until isolation felt self-imposed. Pregnancy intensified everything. What should have introduced vulnerability instead amplified his obsession with legacy. The child became a symbol long before it was acknowledged as a person. He spoke frequently of lineage, continuity, and reputation, as if the future required constant guarding against contamination. His need for certainty hardened into scrutiny. Her body, her schedule, her medical decisions became topics of oversight. Her independence receded incrementally. Professional commitments were postponed, then abandoned, framed as temporary sacrifices. Financial autonomy narrowed through shared accounts that required approval to access. Social connections weakened as proximity to his world demanded exclusivity. Each change was small enough to appear reasonable. Together, they formed containment. Control was consistently framed as protection. He insisted the world was hostile, that scrutiny followed power, that privacy was essential. He positioned himself as the barrier between her and risk, suggesting that autonomy invited danger. The narrative was persuasive because it contained truth. Visibility did invite judgment. But the solution he offered always required surrender. Trust eroded quietly, not through confrontation, but through accumulation. She learned that honesty did not guarantee safety, that transparency could be weaponized. Disagreement invited reinterpretation. Silence preserved stability. Over time, she adapted not because she agreed, but because the cost of resistance exceeded its benefit. The prenuptial agreement reinforced this dynamic. It operated not just as a financial instrument, but as a behavioral framework. Confidentiality clauses discouraged seeking counsel. Reputation clauses discouraged speaking candidly. The agreement assumed imbalance and codified it. It did not anticipate scrutiny from within. Pregnancy made withdrawal impossible. Her visibility increased as her autonomy decreased. Appearances were curated, statements coordinated, movements observed. She became an extension of his narrative rather than a participant in it. When doubts surfaced in his mind, they were not explored privately. They were managed strategically. The accusation that followed did not emerge from nowhere. It was the product of a marriage that treated uncertainty as threat and control as solution. Trust had been replaced long before it was questioned publicly. The public moment simply revealed what had already calcified behind closed doors. What he failed to recognize was that control creates records. Agreements generate obligations. Surveillance leaves trails. The same contract that limited her voice preserved standards he was required to meet. Ethical conduct clauses, non-hostile environment provisions, and reciprocity requirements existed not as decoration, but as enforceable conditions. She began to see the agreement differently, not as a cage but as a map. Every restriction implied a responsibility. Every limitation assumed compliance on both sides. The contract had been designed to suppress unpredictability, not to withstand scrutiny. It relied on silence to function. As trust disappeared, documentation replaced memory. She noted patterns without reacting. She aligned behavior with language. She observed how control was exercised and when it intensified. Pregnancy, rather than weakening her position, clarified it. The agreement did not protect domination. It conditioned it. The marriage did not collapse from lack of affection. It fractured under the weight of imbalance that no longer needed concealment. When trust is absent, every action becomes evidence. When control is public, it invites evaluation. He believed structure guaranteed safety. He overlooked that structure also guarantees traceability. The clause he relied on most, the one that ensured silence and compliance, was bound to ethical reciprocity. It assumed good faith conduct and professional restraint. The moment those assumptions were challenged publicly, the clause transformed from shield to constraint. By building a marriage on control rather than trust, he ensured that truth would eventually become dangerous to him. The contract he believed secured his dominance contained the mechanism that would later expose it. Sometimes disbelief is not about doubt, it's about fear of exposure. For him, the idea that his pregnant wife might be telling the truth was far more dangerous than the possibility that she was lying. Truth would require reflection, accountability, and vulnerability, all of which threatened the identity he had spent decades constructing. Belief, on the other hand, could be shaped, defended, and weaponized, and so he chose belief over reality. His obsession with bloodline had always existed, though it rarely surfaced so openly. Legacy, to him, was not emotional continuity but genetic certainty tied to reputation. He spoke of family as extension, not connection. Every interview, Every keynote, every profile reinforced the same narrative: discipline, control, lineage. A child was not just a personal milestone, but a symbol of permanence. The idea that this symbol could be questioned unsettled him in ways he could not publicly admit. Image mattered as much as inheritance. He had built a persona that thrived on precision and predictability. Investors trusted him because he appeared uncompromising. The public admired him because he seemed infallible. Any ambiguity around something as fundamental as paternity threatened that image. It introduced unpredictability. And unpredictability to someone like him was intolerable. Advisors played their role carefully. None of them directly accused his wife of deception, but they encouraged skepticism under the guise of prudence. They spoke of optics, of potential risk, of the importance of certainty when so much was at stake. Their language was cautious, but their effect was clear. Doubt was reframed as responsibility. Suspicion became strategy. The more he listened, the more disbelief hardened into necessity. If he accepted her truth, he would have to confront questions about his own behavior, his own absence, his own assumptions. He would have to admit that control does not guarantee certainty. Denial spared him that confrontation. It allowed him to externalize discomfort rather than examine it. Fear of reputational collapse loomed constantly, though he never named it as such. The accusation was not about the child alone. It was about what the child represented. A challenge to lineage was a challenge to authority. If the public perceived weakness at home, it could invite scrutiny elsewhere. He had spent his career eliminating openings. This felt like one he had failed to anticipate. Past secrets lingered quietly beneath his certainty. Not scandals, not crimes, but compromises. Decisions made in private that contradicted the values he promoted publicly. Relationships managed discreetly. Health matters addressed quietly. None of these had ever surfaced because they had never been questioned. But truth has a way of connecting unrelated threads once attention is focused. He sensed, instinctively, that accepting her version of events could invite examination beyond paternity. Public denial became his shield. By asserting disbelief openly, he framed the narrative before anyone else could. He did not wait for evidence or discussion. He defined the conflict on his terms, positioning himself as the rational party seeking clarity. In doing so, he forced his wife into a defensive position without ever asking a direct question in private. The denial was strategic. It shifted burden. She was expected to prove innocence rather than he being required to justify accusation. The audience, conditioned to trust his authority, accepted this reversal without challenge. The silence that followed reinforced his confidence. He mistook the absence of protest for validation. What he did not acknowledge was that disbelief can be louder than accusation. By insisting she was lying, he revealed the extent of his fear. Confidence does not require performance. Control does not require spectacle. His need to deny publicly exposed his anxiety far more than her silence ever could. Internally, the logic became circular. He believed she was lying because the alternative felt impossible. And the alternative felt impossible because it threatened everything he had built. Rather than question his assumptions, he questioned her integrity. Rather than examine his fear, he projected it. The more the situation escalated, the more committed he became to disbelief. Retreat would have appeared like doubt. Doubt would have appeared like weakness. Weakness would have invited inquiry. Each step locked him further into his position. He was no longer defending truth. He was defending himself. His wife observed this shift without reacting. She understood that his disbelief was not rooted in evidence, but in necessity. He needed her to be lying because truth required humility. And humility was the one thing his identity could not accommodate. As public attention intensified, he doubled down. Interviews were deflected. Statements were controlled. The narrative was repeated until it felt stable. Repetition created familiarity. Familiarity created acceptance. He believed that time, combined with authority, would resolve the issue in his favor. But disbelief has limits. It demands confirmation. Eventually, assertion alone becomes insufficient. To maintain credibility, it must be supported by proof. Advisors suggested closure. Media pressure encouraged resolution. The longer the question lingered, the more it threatened to expand. That was when he made the decision that sealed his fate. To end speculation, to restore control, to prove his certainty, he demanded a DNA test. Publicly, confidently, certain that the result would validate his disbelief and erase doubt permanently. He believed the test would end her credibility. He believed evidence would align with power. What he failed to understand was that proof does not serve belief. It serves reality. And reality does not adjust itself to fear. By demanding verification, he crossed a boundary he could not retreat from. Disbelief had carried him this far, but evidence would not bend to narrative. The moment he insisted on proof, he transferred control away from himself. Convinced she was lying, he pushed forward without hesitation, unaware that the truth he sought would not protect him. It would expose the very fear he had tried so desperately to conceal. Arrogance often demands proof without understanding consequences. By the time he insisted on a DNA test, the decision no longer felt reactive to him. It felt inevitable, framed as the final step in restoring order. In his mind, uncertainty was the real enemy, not the accusation itself. Proof, he believed, would reassert hierarchy, silence doubt, and close a chapter that had grown uncomfortably visible. He did not request the test privately. Privacy would have suggested hesitation. Instead, the demand was made in full view of advisors, legal counsel, and media intermediaries who understood exactly what message he wanted to send. The framing was deliberate. This was not about suspicion, he claimed. It was about responsibility, about clarity, about protecting everyone involved from speculation. Language was chosen carefully, scrubbed of emotion, polished into something that sounded reasonable. Legal teams moved quickly to shape the process. Documents were drafted to define jurisdiction, chain of custody, and disclosure boundaries. Every step was designed to protect him from collateral risk. He wanted certainty without vulnerability, verification without exposure. The test was positioned as neutral, scientific, beyond narrative. He trusted procedure because procedure had always favored him. Media anticipation grew as details leaked with strategic precision. Commentators framed the test as inevitable, some even praising his decisiveness. The story shifted from accusation to countdown. Speculation filled the space between silence and result. Each day without an answer deepened the narrative that something needed to be resolved. He welcomed that pressure, believing it would corner her into reaction. She did not react. When informed of the demand, she did not argue, delay, or negotiate. Her acceptance was immediate and calm. There were no conditions, no public statements, no visible emotion. That composure unsettled those watching more than resistance ever could. To some, it appeared like confidence. To others, like resignation. To him, it looked like surrender. Her calm reinforced his certainty. He interpreted it as quiet defeat, proof that she knew what the test would reveal. His confidence became visible arrogance. In private conversations, he spoke as though the outcome was already known. He planned statements for after the result, rehearsed explanations, mapped recovery. The test, he believed, was a formality. What he underestimated was how documentation changes power. The moment the test was formalized, it entered systems beyond his influence. Laboratories followed protocols, not reputations. Results would be archived, time-stamped, and traceable. The process he trusted to protect him would not adjust for expectation. It would only report findings. As days passed, the anticipation sharpened. Every delay was interpreted as drama. Analysts debated implications. Friends took sides quietly. He remained composed outwardly, but internally, the need for resolution intensified. Control had always come from decisiveness. Waiting was unfamiliar territory. The test itself was unremarkable, clinical, stripped of symbolism. Samples were collected, verified, sealed. No speeches were made. No cameras allowed. For a moment, everything returned to procedure. That neutrality should have reassured him. Instead, it unsettled him. Without narrative, without performance, there was nothing to manage. He filled the silence with certainty. Advisors echoed confidence. The story, they believed, would end with confirmation and closure. His wife's credibility would dissolve. The public would move on. The empire would stabilize. It was a simple equation, and he had never known such equations to fail him before. She continued to wait without comment. Her restraint contrasted sharply with the noise surrounding the test. While others speculated, she documented. While narratives formed, she observed. The test was not her defense. It was his demand. She understood that distinction. Proof does not belong to the accused. It belongs to the process. As the date for results approached, tension shifted subtly. What had begun as a weapon started to feel like a mirror. Advisors became cautious. Language softened. Contingencies were discussed quietly. The certainty that once defined the room thinned into conditional confidence. No one voiced doubt, but no one dismissed it either. He sensed the shift and dismissed it. Doubt, to him, was contagious weakness. He doubled down, repeating his version of events, reinforcing the narrative that this was about truth, not power. He believed repetition would anchor reality. He had used that strategy before successfully. What he failed to recognize was that evidence does not respond to insistence. It does not accelerate or delay itself for comfort. It does not interpret intention. The test would deliver information, nothing more, nothing less. And information, once released, does not belong to those who demanded it. When the results arrived, they did not come with ceremony. They came as data clinically worded, stripped of implication. But even before they were read aloud, something had already changed. The test had shifted authority away from narrative and into record. Whatever it confirmed would exist independently of belief. He had demanded proof to end her, to discredit her, to close the story on his terms. What he did not anticipate was that the proof would expand the story instead. That the question he asked was not the only one the evidence would answer. The DNA test was supposed to restore control. Instead, it unlocked buried truths that had waited patiently beneath certainty. Truths that did not require accusation to exist. Truths that would not stop at paternity. As the envelope was opened and the results prepared for disclosure, it became clear that the test had already done its work. It had exposed arrogance, revealed fear, and transferred power. Whatever the numbers confirmed, they would confirm more than lineage. They would confirm who had tried to control truth, and who had trusted it to speak for itself. Truth does not argue, it arrives documented. When the DNA report was released, it did not come with commentary or context, only data arranged with clinical precision. Numbers replaced speculation. Percentages replaced rumor. The language was neutral, indifferent to expectation or power. And in that indifference, the entire narrative shifted. The confirmation was absolute. The child was his. There was no ambiguity, no margin for interpretation. The result validated what his wife had never felt the need to prove and dismantled the accusation he had delivered so confidently. In a single document, weeks of public doubt collapsed into certainty. The accusation that had framed her as deceptive now framed him as reckless. The effect was immediate. Conversations that had once revolved around suspicion fell silent. Advisors stopped speaking mid-sentence. Media outlets paused updates that had been prepared in advance. The story did not require explanation anymore. It required recalibration. What had been framed as a question of paternity was now undeniably a question of judgment. Public narrative does not collapse loudly. It dissolves. Headlines were revised without apology. Language shifted from inquiry to consequence. Analysts who had entertained his doubt now emphasized restraint and accountability. The same authority that once amplified his words now amplified the result that contradicted them. Credibility does not disappear because of error alone. It disappears because of certainty proven wrong. Silence replaced accusation. The room that had once echoed with confidence now felt constrained by absence. There were no triumphant statements, no attempts at humor or deflection. Silence became the only viable response, not because there was nothing to say, but because anything said would further document the failure of judgment. His wife did not celebrate. She did not speak publicly or correct the record with emotion. Her response remained consistent with everything that had come before. The truth had arrived. Her role was finished. Vindication did not require performance. The restraint that had been misread as weakness now read as discipline. Media perception reversed with striking efficiency. Stories that once framed her silence as suspicious now described it as strategic. Analysts noted her composure, her refusal to escalate, her reliance on process. The contrast between her patience and his insistence became the defining feature of coverage. One had demanded proof, the other had trusted it. His credibility suffered damage that could not be repaired with clarification. The problem was not the accusation itself. It was the certainty with which it had been delivered and the power used to amplify it. Authority invites trust, but it also magnifies error. The higher the confidence, the steeper the fall. Attempts to contextualize the accusation followed quietly. Advisors floated language about stress, pressure, misunderstanding. None of it gained traction. The record was clear. The accusation had been public. The proof had been definitive. Context does not erase documentation. It only underscores it. Behind closed doors, the implications expanded. The DNA report was no longer just a personal matter. It became part of a timeline that included public statements, legal framing, and documented conduct. Questions emerged not about the result, but about the behavior that led to its demand. Why was doubt asserted publicly? Why was verification weaponized? Why was certainty declared without evidence? These questions were not asked aloud yet, but they existed within systems designed to track risk. The report was archived, referenced, aligned with earlier actions. What had been intended as closure became linkage. The proof did not end scrutiny. It redirected it. His advisors recognized the shift before he did. Damage control transformed into containment. Language was reviewed, past interviews reconsidered. The focus moved from defending an accusation to managing its consequences. The empire had relied on narrative control. That control was now compromised by a document that did not respond to persuasion. The public did not turn hostile, turned observant. There is a difference. Outrage fades quickly. Attention does not. The attention now followed patterns rather than personalities. Analysts examined how power had been exercised, how silence had been interpreted, how certainty had been imposed. The story matured from scandal to case study. His wife remained absent from the discourse. That absence became a form of presence. The more others spoke, the more her restraint stood out. She had not argued truth into existence. She had allowed it to arrive. In a landscape saturated with reaction, that choice carried weight. The DNA report raised questions no one had prepared to answer. If the accusation was unfounded, what had motivated it? If the demand for proof was unnecessary, what had it been protecting? If certainty had been misplaced here, where else had it been assumed without verification? These questions lingered because they could not be dismissed as personal. They intersected with governance, ethics, and accountability. The report, by confirming paternity, inadvertently confirmed something else, that power had been exercised without restraint, and that restraint had belonged to the person accused. As the days passed, the initial shock settled into assessment. Institutions do not react emotionally. They review. The DNA result became a reference point, not an endpoint. It marked the moment where narrative authority transferred from voice to record, from belief to documentation. He understood then that the test had not ended the story. It had expanded it. The proof he demanded had not silenced doubt. It had redirected it toward him. The real lie exposed was not about lineage. It was about control, the assumption that truth could be summoned, shaped, and dismissed at will. The accusation had been loud. The confirmation was quiet. But quiet truths endure longer. They do not need repetition. They persist in archives, in analyses, in memory. The DNA report did what no argument could. It ended the debate and began the reckoning. What followed would not be immediate or dramatic. There would be no single moment of collapse. Instead, there would be alignment of documents, of timelines, of questions waiting patiently for answers. The proof had arrived, and with it, a realization no one was prepared to confront. The test had answered the wrong question perfectly, and in doing so, exposed the one that mattered most. Sometimes evidence answers the wrong question and exposes the right one. The DNA test was meant to end speculation, to draw a clean line under an uncomfortable chapter. Instead, it redirected attention with surgical precision. By confirming paternity, it removed the only uncertainty that had justified public accusation. What remained was behavior, and behavior invites review. Once certainty replaced doubt, the spotlight shifted away from the child and toward the man who had demanded proof. The first examination was procedural. Legal counsel reviewed timelines, statements, and documentation surrounding the demand for testing. What began as a narrow inquiry widened quickly. His medical history, previously treated as private and irrelevant, was requested under routine disclosure standards triggered by the public nature of his claims. The request was not accusatory. It was administrative. That neutrality made it unavoidable. Records revealed patterns that had never been scrutinized because no one had asked the right questions. Treatments scheduled around key business travel. Consultations conducted discreetly. Health disclosures minimized in filings that required accuracy. None of it constituted wrongdoing on its own, but together it suggested a habit of selective transparency. The same instinct that had driven him to control narrative at home appeared to have guided his decisions elsewhere. Advisors began to panic quietly. The shift from defense to investigation is subtle but unmistakable. Language changes. Conversations move from reassurance to verification. Files are reopened not to find fault, but to ensure consistency. Consistency, once questioned, demands proof, and proof, once demanded, rarely remains contained. Internal teams initiated reviews under the banner of risk management. The DNA test had established a precedent. Public assertion followed by formal verification. That sequence could not exist in isolation. If accuracy mattered here, it mattered everywhere. Financial disclosures, governance statements, and compliance certifications were re-examined with fresh eyes. What had once been accepted as authority now required corroboration. Patterns of manipulation surfaced not as accusations, but as alignments. Decisions that concentrated control. Processes that minimized oversight. Narratives that framed dissent as instability. The marriage, once considered separate from business, began to look like an extension of a broader philosophy. Control was not situational. It was systemic. The realization unsettled those closest to him. Advisors who had justified certainty now questioned its foundation. They revisited moments where his confidence had overridden caution, where speed had replaced deliberation. The DNA test had not created these moments. It had connected them. Evidence has a way of revealing continuity. Corporate scrutiny began with routine requests and escalated through necessity. Regulators do not accuse without cause, but they follow signals. A public accusation disproven by documentation is a signal. It suggests impulse, overreach, and disregard for consequence. Those traits, when observed in leadership, trigger evaluation. Not punishment, evaluation. Legal teams prepared for expansion. Not because wrongdoing was confirmed, but because exposure had increased. The difference matters. Exposure invites inquiry. Inquiry generates records. Records endure. The empire had been built on confidence and discretion. Now it faced documentation and memory. His response followed familiar patterns. He emphasized misunderstanding, context, intention. He framed actions as protective rather than controlling. The language was careful, but it no longer carried authority. Once evidence enters the conversation, intention becomes secondary. Systems measure outcomes, not motives. What unsettled him most was the loss of narrative ownership. For years, he had defined the terms of every conversation. Now, terms were defined by process. He could not accelerate reviews or redirect questions. He could only respond. That inversion marked a fundamental shift in power. The examination of his medical history raised no dramatic revelations, but it illuminated something more consequential. Selective disclosure aligned with convenience. Truth presented when advantageous. Silence when scrutiny loomed. The same instinct that had labeled his wife's silence as suspicious now reflected back at him. Advisors debated strategy, but strategy had limited reach. The crisis had expanded beyond marriage into an institutional reckoning. The DNA test had become a reference point, cited in discussions about judgment, restraint, and governance. It symbolized not deception, but the consequences of certainty without verification. Publicly, the tone shifted again. Media coverage moved away from scandal and toward structure. Analysts discussed leadership temperament, decision-making frameworks, and accountability cultures. His name appeared less as a subject of debate and more as a case example. That transition is difficult to reverse. Case examples outlive headlines. Privately, isolation deepened. Advisors filtered access. Conversations shortened. Where there had once been affirmation, there was now assessment. Trust, once assumed, became conditional. He recognized the pattern too late. The systems he had relied upon were functioning exactly as designed. They were simply no longer serving him. The most damaging revelation was not any single record, but coherence. The DNA test aligned with behavior, behavior aligned with control, control aligned with risk. When evidence forms a pattern, it becomes narrative independent of voice. No statement could dismantle it without documentation to replace it. His wife remained outside the process. That distance reinforced the contrast. She had not demanded scrutiny. She had not initiated investigation. She had allowed procedure to unfold. The difference between initiating and enduring became clear. One approach invites resistance. The other invites validation. As reviews continued, boundaries dissolved between personal conduct and professional consequence. The separation he had relied upon no longer held. Public actions create public implications. Private certainty, when disproven publicly, invites systemic response. The DNA test had done more than confirm lineage. It had confirmed a philosophy of control incompatible with accountability. The reckoning did not announce itself. There were no press conferences or dramatic exits. There were requests, reviews, and revisions. Authority was redistributed quietly. Decisions required consensus. Oversight increased. The empire adapted not out of loyalty, but out of necessity. He began to understand the scope of what he had triggered. The test he demanded to assert dominance had become a gateway, not to punishment but to evaluation. Evaluation, once initiated, does not conclude quickly. It expands until alignment is achieved or exposure is complete. The crisis was no longer about a marriage or an accusation. It was about leadership under scrutiny, about whether control had replaced judgment, about whether certainty had overridden restraint. These questions did not require answers to persist. They required only evidence to remain relevant. As files circulated and timelines aligned, one truth became unavoidable. The DNA test had not revealed deception in his wife. It had revealed vulnerability in him. A vulnerability not of biology, but of temperament. The inability to tolerate uncertainty without imposing consequence. The reckoning ahead would not be decided in courtrooms or headlines alone. It would unfold in reviews, in governance reforms, in quiet decisions that reshape authority. The DNA test had answered the wrong question perfectly, and in doing so, it had exposed the right one. The crisis had expanded beyond marriage into an institutional reckoning, and there would be no return to the comfort of belief without proof. Eckerd. He understood then that the judgment approaching would not be delivered by a single ruling or announcement. It would be cumulative. It would live in policy changes, leadership adjustments, and institutional memory. The empire he had built was not collapsing theatrically. It was reorganizing without him at its center. The final judgment would not be financial. Losses could be managed, assets restructured, positions reassigned. What could not be restored was narrative authority. The ability to define reality had slipped away, transferred to documentation and oversight. That transfer is irreversible. As attention moved forward, his name became shorthand rather than headline. A reference point in discussions about leadership under scrutiny. A case cited quietly. The story no longer belonged to him, and that realization settled heavily. Control had been his defining trait. Losing it revealed how much of his identity depended on it. The unraveling continued without spectacle, exactly as systems prefer. No one needed to destroy the empire. It simply adjusted to survive. And in that adjustment, it left behind the man who had once believed certainty was enough to command truth. Vindication did not arrive with fireworks for Olivia. It arrived with a calendar, a filing number, and the quiet relief of being believed. After the DNA report confirmed what she had carried alone for months, she refused the temptation to trade humiliation for humiliation. She understood that revenge feeds on noise, and noise gives powerful men room to redirect the story. Patience, by contrast, leaves only the record. While headlines chased his reactions, she stayed focused on procedure, letting attorneys and compliance officers speak in the only language institutions respect: dates, signatures, and enforceable duties. Each step she took was designed to protect the child first, and to make every future lie expensive for him. The prenuptial agreement he once praised as risk management became her most reliable weapon because it carried his fingerprints on every clause. Ethan had demanded confidentiality, reputational safeguards, and strict definitions of misconduct, assuming those standards would apply only to her. Olivia's team reread the document as a checklist of obligations he had broken in plain sight: public disparagement, hostile treatment, and the use of corporate platforms for personal coercion. She did not need to prove he was cruel. She only needed to show he violated his own conditions. When enforcement hearings began, the judge treated the contract as neutral math, and Ethan's confidence as irrelevant. For the time, his protections became her protections too. Custody planning was handled with the same restraint. Olivia requested safeguards, not punishment, and framed every request around stability. Uninterrupted healthcare, secure housing, and clear boundaries on media contact. She produced logs of frozen accounts, delayed approvals, and the staged narratives that had tried to paint her as unstable. None of it was theatrical, yet it formed a coherent pattern of pressure. Ethan's attorneys attempted to argue that private conflict should stay private, but the court saw the contradiction. He had made it public when he needed leverage. The ruling emphasized the child's welfare and ordered protections that limited his ability to weaponize access again. It also required all communication to be documented through counsel. With the legal framework settled, Olivia stepped out of the spotlight as deliberately as she had entered it. She declined interview offers, refused book deal flirtations, and asked friends to stop defending her online. The record was already loud enough. She moved into a sunlit townhouse under her own name, resumed limited consulting work, and rebuilt professional relationships that had been paused, not broken. People who had doubted her now reached out with apologies. She accepted none of them publicly, because public forgiveness can become another stage. Her days became quieter, structured around prenatal appointments and calm routines, while his days became meetings about damage control and reputation triage. Hour confirmed she was free from him. Ethan, meanwhile, discovered that wealth cannot outbid a damaged narrative once institutions stop treating him as exceptional. Investor calls turned colder, board discussions shorter, and compliance reviews more frequent. He tried to recast the DNA result as a misunderstanding, but even supporters struggled to defend the cruelty of the original accusation. He became the example whispered to ambitious executives. The man who confused dominance for certainty and forced science to settle a question his ego invented. His inner circle thinned as risk grew. The marketing executive who had amplified his messaging asked for distance, legal counsel advised silence, and the press began citing sources familiar with governance concerns, instead of quoting him directly ever again. What made his decline irreversible was that Olivia never needed to attack him. She simply refused to carry his story for him. When people asked why she stayed silent at the gala, She let attorneys answer with timestamps and transcripts. When acquaintances suggested she should publicly forgive, she reminded them privately that forgiveness is not a substitute for accountability. Her restraint forced observers to evaluate his actions without distraction. Even the prenuptial confidentiality clauses, once meant to limit her, became boundaries that prevented him from baiting a public fight. The truth stood on its own, supported by documents he had demanded, signed, and assumed would never be used against him in the court of record. As her due date approached, Olivia's world narrowed to what mattered: health, safety, and a future that did not depend on anyone's approval. She built a small circle of support: one physician she trusted, one neighbor who checked in, one colleague who offered remote work without questions. The calm was not naive. It was earned. She knew that the moment the child arrived, every boundary would be tested, and every agreement would need to function. Preparations were quiet but thorough: secure contact protocols, a private delivery plan, and a folder of documents ready for any sudden challenge. She was not waiting for justice anymore. She was living it, and the city could not rewrite her name. The settlement documents triggered secondary consequences he could not negotiate away. Because the accusation had been made on a corporate stage, investigators treated it as executive conduct, and governance committees reviewed how company resources had been used to isolate his wife. Policies were rewritten, expense authorizations tightened, and a new ethics hotline was publicized with unusual urgency. Former allies testified to routine intimidation in meetings, careful never to call it abuse, only pressure that crossed professional lines. None of it sounded dramatic, which made it credible. Ethan watched from a distance as his own compliance machinery became the narrator, producing reports that carried his name without emotion and without mercy for anyone still watching, quietly. Olivia's victory was quieter than people expected, but it was heavier. She relearned how to occupy space without anticipating criticism, how to answer a phone without bracing for interrogation, how to celebrate a small kindness without suspecting a hidden price. She kept the child's surname simple and unmarketable, a choice that felt like breathing. When acquaintances asked whether she hated Ethan, she offered no diagnosis. Hatred would keep him central, and she had already rebuilt a life where he was peripheral. Her focus stayed on the future: a home with predictable routines, a career rebuilt on her terms, and a truth her child would inherit without shame. Nothing about that future required his permission anymore. Months later, when the corporate drama faded into compliance updates and business school panels, the conclusion remained simple. Ethan had demanded a DNA test to protect his image, and the image had fractured because the test proved he was the liar about her. He lost not only a marriage, but the privilege of controlling what others believed. Olivia did not win by taking anything from him. She won by keeping what he tried to take from her: truth, dignity, and the right to be seen as whole. The empire that once surrounded his voice ended in archived documents and quiet reforms. And the woman he tried to erase refused to disappear. That was the ending that lasted. Stories like this don't shout, they stay with you. If this one made you pause, reflect, or see power differently, it's worth passing on. Stay connected for stories where truth isn't loud, but it always lasts. Your support keeps these real-life reckonings alive.